Thank you, all strands. Thank you also very much for coming out in support of independent bookstores and in support of books. I wrote a book, kind of shocked, actually. But it is my great pleasure, actually tonight, a very dangerous man is in the house, my editor, Matt Weiland, who was pivotal in keeping me under control as I tried to craft perhaps the most unlikely structured book in the history of writing, where I attempted to replicate fairly closely the way we remember, which of course has no chronology. And he was kind enough to suggest that each chapter might just begin in youth and chronologically progress towards its end, which is how it is in its final form, although each chapter does reset to childhood. Following themes, it does replicate in some ways the pathways we remember through, and that's how this book was built, choosing elements and following them. So, if my hair catches on fire tonight, please excuse that. I just have dangerous amounts of hairspray on. So, thank you. I'm going to read a couple small selections, which will give you a kind of a look into me, and I exist in this book as a messenger. This book isn't really about me. It's not a portrait of me. It's not a portrait of my family. It's not a biography. It's not a war memoir. It's a portrait of my perspective. And what is most important in the reading of this book is the reader. Hopefully, what I've done will in some way guide you into your own memory. This is a book of memory, the power of the child's belief, and how that child echoes in our lives, and also how our memories endure and preserve everything in some ways. We are very much a product of who we've always been, and I think that most people who knew me as a child, and there are a few, I have a Marky Hasbach, who knew me back in Norwich, New York, are unsurprised by the number of things that I end up getting into, my various endeavors, because I was somewhat set. My impulses were fairly realized young, and in delving into my memory, which was what I had to do to make this book, I really found myself relatively unchanged in many ways. Experience is all change, but the journey from where we begin to where we end has in it some very powerful threads, and that's what I traced in making this book. Some of you know me from acting, so I'm going to read an early passage of my first public performance and then take it forward to my first serious performance, in my mind, on homicide. So my father dragged us to England, which was in no way a labor for me, because I thought that was my natural place. And they had knights in England. And while we were there, the British were very serious about drama, even in elementary schools. And so I got into a play, and the play was about Queen Boadicea, also known as Queen Boudica. And I'll just set the tone for what comes later in my performance in Homicide. So here I am in England. I attended school there, and my class spent the year studying Roman Britain. The teachers organized a play about Queen Boadicea, an early Celtic leader of the Iceni tribe who fought heroically against Roman control in Britain. We could either be legionaries or Celts. I wanted to be in the legion, but I was cast as one of Boadicea's warriors. We were referred to as barbarians, not Celts, taking on the name given to unruly peoples north of Rome, and we were considered a horde instead of an army. It seemed yet another step down. We were sent home with a list of things to make and instructions on how to dress for the play. I showed the requirements to my father, who looked at them as if he couldn't read, and handed them to my mother. Shield, sword, belt, dark cloak. To make a shield, she gave me a large piece of cardboard from a grocery box, and we covered up the tomatoes printed on it with glue and brown butcher's paper. I said a warrior, barbarian or not, would never emblazon his shield with vegetables. I drew undersized dragons on it which looked like smudges at a distance, and lightning stabbing from the center. My mother found some black material which she wrapped over one shoulder and fastened around my waist on the opposite side with a safety pin. I wore brown shorts, no shirt, and one of my father's belts wrapped almost twice around my hips. Last was my sword. My mother was at a loss for how to make a sword. We finally just cut up strips of the cardboard, glued them together, and then wrapped them in black plastic from a garbage bag. It looked terrible. I was very disappointed. My father was happy to be free of blame for the errors I found in wardrobe and armaments. My costume might have done well in America where expectations were low, but when I arrived at school, I was immediately ashamed. Some of the children came to class in elaborate armor that looked like accurate replicas of Roman uniforms. Their parents had spent weeks working on them, and the children were afraid to move much for fear of tearing something that had been carefully glued. The barbarians ranged in their interpretation, and we did look somewhat like a horde. The teachers had built an impressive wooden chariot as well as 2 matching horse costumes with papier-mâché heads and brown cloth bodies, each worn over 2 men. Half blind, they pulled the chariot around the room with a girl who played the queen standing in it, and we followed. We rehearsed for days. My part consisted of nothing more than following Boadicea's chariot in the room, chanting angry nonsense, waving my embarrassing sword, lining up against the Romans, and then charging to my dramatic death. On the day of the performance, for 100 parents, the staff, and several hundred students, we dressed in our classroom, and the Romans marched into the auditorium. The Legion looked wonderfully imperial, but I was relieved not to have been chosen for Rome. I could imagine how my armor would have looked if I had been left to craft it from a tomato box. We assembled in the hall outside while speeches were made inside. At some point, we were given a signal and made our entrance. My parents said that as we came in yelling, I was a barbarian most noticeably smiling. Boadicea gave her speech about liberty, and then we were to attack the Roman ranks, failing to achieve our freedom. I rushed up the steps at a boy wearing imposing leather Roman armor, and he made an uncomfortable slash at me. This was my cue to perish. In rehearsals, I had gone through the motions, pretending slowly to pretend, but this was the performance. I threw myself backward with a scream, my feet coming off the stage, sword and shield tossed into the air, and I struck the oak floor on my back with a smack that sounded loud, even to me. I was told afterward that half of the parents stood up, and the play went silent with a gasp. I lay unmoving, arms extended, eyes closed, laboring to control my breath. A teacher hurried to my side and stooped, trying very hard not to let her voice sound hysterical. "Can you hear me, dear?" she asked. She had her hand on my chest. It was cold. "Yes," I hissed, trying not to move my lips. "Are you hurt, sweetie? Can you move?" "I've been killed," I whispered, keeping my eyes closed. That I heard my mother's voice in consultation as she withdrew, and the play went on, more boys falling carefully on the floor at the foot of the stage, the constrained sword strokes of boys dressed too well for fighting. Queen Boadicea, seeing all of her men killed, made another speech, drank poison, slumped in her chariot, and was pulled out of the room by the teachers dressed as horses. I had pretended at war again and had again been killed in front of my parents. It was my first memorable public performance in a blend of the 2 professions I would go on to pursue most seriously. Pushing forward. At this point, I've graduated from Vassar with a studio art degree, which led me directly to the Marine Corps, which is a natural progression of anyone from Vassar. We're a heavy source of infantry officers in the Marine Corps. And after my first period of active duty down at Camp Lejeune, 4 years, I came back to what was our first home, and I wanted to get back into acting before, of course, immediately rejoining the reserves and spending another 14 years in the service of the Corps. So here I am at the end of my first tour, as it were, 1996. A great deal of peace during that period of time. After a 3-year tour at Camp Lejeune in the infantry, my wife and I moved into a little house in College Park, Maryland, our first home together. I had wanted to audition for Homicide: Life on the Street because it was a good television show and it was filmed